I'm Charlie Sykes. Welcome to the Contrary podcast. Boy, there's so much to talk about today. We're joined by my good friend Harry Littman, who is the host of the Talking Feds podcast and also the Talking Feds Substack newsletter. Good morning, first of all, Harry.
Good morning, Charlie. Always good to be with you, even on such a harrowing day as this.
Well, when have we not had a harrowing day? Okay, so I want to start off with something that I don't fully understand. Okay, I'm going to put myself down as an extreme Gavin Newsom skeptic. However, he gave a hell of a speech the other night, and I wanted to get your reaction because I have not been paying that much attention. I'll be honest with you. I think he's kind of flailed around. He obviously is running for president. I guess the question is has he really emerged as the anti-Trump leader? Has he found his voice? Now, here's the New York Times report, which I'm sure people have seen already. Governor Gavin Newsom made the case in a televised address Tuesday evening that President Trump's decision to send military forces to immigration protests in Los Angeles has put the nation at the precipice of authoritarianism. The California governor urged Americans to stand up to Mr. Trump, calling it a perilous moment for democracy and the country's long-held legal norms. California may be first, he said, but it clearly won't end here. Other states are next. Democracy is next. Democracy is under assault right before our eyes. The moment we feared has arrived. So I just want to focus on that, Harry.
Okay.
The moment we fear has arrived. Your thoughts?
Okay. Well, so of course it's in two parts. You started out, Charlie, by saying, is he emerging as the anti-Trump? And certainly he's the guy on the ground where, he's in the big state where it happens, though, as he and others have pointed out, there's nothing about Trump's orders that do not, that prevent him from going to other states. I do think he's making that move, but in general, we're so far away from who will emerge and why that I think we can put that to the side. But let's say he is right. Let's say he is right that this is going to be blessed by the courts and the U.S. Supreme Court. Are we there? Because I had been thinking, and maybe you as well, that we dodged the big bullet in the immigration context where the court said, we've got to decide whether there's due process. We've got to decide if this is an insurrection and the like. But he is, I've spent most of the last 24 hours looking at the lot. There ain't a lot. And the concrete worry legally is that the Supreme Court or the Ninth Circuit or Chuck Breyer will say something like this. Trump says there's a rebellion going on now. That's why he can federalize the National Guard. Or if he invokes Insurrection Act because there's an insurrection. Doesn't seem, it's much less than other insurrections and rebellions have been in the past. Newsom says not. But it's the kind of power that we have to defer to Trump's judgment on, even though it's so outsized on his part. If something like that happens and we have sort of even potentially boots on the street under the Insurrection Act, which is what he permits to do, man, oh man, it feels like a kind of precipice. It feels like a kind of seminal crossover to authoritarianism. And it is, I think, to really scare all your listeners. And by the way, again, it's a pleasure to be on this Substack. There's a lot out there. I don't listen to them all. This is one I listen to. It could be a precursor to trying to do similar mischief with elections. Oh, emergency there. There's all this fraud afoot, et cetera. And that would be a true calamity.
So there are two schools of wishful thinking out there that I think we have to address. One was that, the troops are going to disregard or will disobey the orders. I don't think that's going to happen. We can set that aside for the moment. And the second is the courts will continue to serve as a guardrail. And you're making the case that, in fact, the way the law is written, it feels like there are so many loopholes. There are so many ways around this that, in fact, the court might bless this. Look, the reality is that this has been Trump's fantasy for years. The militarization of law enforcement. He's talked about this over and over and over again, sending troops into cities and states, even over the opposition of the local officials. And he's got a fetish for not just the cruelty, but the brutality of the use of force. It feels as if all of the stars are aligning, though, with Trump using all of these emergency powers of the presidency, militarizing his agenda on the weekend in which we're going to have this massive military birthday party parade for him.
Right.
I mean, it's for people who had said Donald Trump, will put boots on the ground in your city. We were accused of Trump derangement syndrome, but here we are,
Yeah.
Harry.
100%. I try also to be sober and really take stock of where the courts will be. I agree with you that the troops won't be defiant. And even if they were, that's not what we're worried about. There are legal tools for it. But you're 100% right. The stars are aligned in a way that's been in his sort of fantasy life for years. And I'll just say one more thing. It's in this very issue that he has led with from the start, and the notion, the false notion, let's just be objective about it, that somehow immigrants are overrunning the country and committing all these terrible crimes. That's neither happening in fact on the ground, nor with the people they're arresting, who are overwhelmingly simply don't have their papers in order. So I do think that when you look at the other very, very rare instances, like the Rodney King riots, where the governor said, please come help us, we're in trouble. Or even in Little Rock, where president eventually said, I'm going to come in because you're not doing your job, Governor Wallace. They are much more acute risks of transgressions of federal power, or just complete bedlam, in Compton in 1992. We don't have that. So the concrete worry that I, as a lawyer, have is that the courts will give him a sort of free pass, thinking, well, the president needs this power, and who are we to say whether it fits or not? You have Gavin Newsom in his brief, and they've ordered a very, very quick answer. That government probably has already answered, and there'll be a hearing tomorrow saying, guys, this is not a rebellion. Here's what a rebellion means. This is a law enforcement disturbance. We're handling it fine, and you're just totally putting gas on the flames. I think that's right. But if he's permitted to do it legally, because the courts take this stance of we're just worried about contradicting him, then I think we're in I agree with Newsom. We're on the precipice of something. Then it goes, I'll say this and sort of turn it back to you. Then I think it does become a political issue. And the question is whether the, protesters can push back on him. But it's kind of Tiananmen Square, right? I mean, he's ready to roll out the troops. He doesn't care. He seems to like the fact that he's in this really militaristic.
Remember how he remember how he reacted to Tiananmen Square. He thought that was strong. He actually admired that. That was always in the back of my mind. Okay, I want to get to the politics of this in a moment, and the way the protests are actually playing out, and see whether we have the same perspective on all of that. But let's talk a little bit about sort of the history and the norms of the use of troops. So no president has federalized the National Guard against the wishes of a governor since the mid-1960s. Almost every single time the National Guard is used, it's with the cooperation of the governor. But that was in a very different time, right? I mean, that was when Lyndon Johnson was using that to protect civil rights workers. Just talk to me a little bit about the tradition of, and how rare it is to override a governor's position.
So first, the tradition. This is really an absolute axiomatic kind of tenet of where do military people go on their, go on the ground and do domestic law enforcement? Authoritarian societies. We don't do that here. And this is up there, with other countries as well. It's almost a Magna Carta level, understanding. Yes. We don't do that. And you're right. The very few times, the handful of times it's happened has been because governors said, please, we need you, with the sole exception being when in the governor of Alabama said, I don't care what you say, I'm not going to let these people in school. In other words, when federal rights were being transgressed, that is the only provision that Trump could use if he goes to the Insurrection Act. He could say somehow there is a violation of federal rights, and it's kind of tenuous. But sticking with the politics for a moment, I do think, and I think the administration thinks, That's the Rubicon. 10 USC 12406, which he's using now as like a number to people. And what he's done is federalize the National Guard, say, you guys work for me insofar as you have to protect now, but that's all you can do. You can't be general law enforcement types, just protect federal buildings, federal property. Insurrection Act would be the big step
Okay.
over to the other side, and the side that we in this country just do not countenance unless, we're at Fort Sumter, the whole republic's on the line.
I have no doubt whatsoever that he intends to invoke the Insurrection Act and will do so. Do you agree?
I agree. And it's
Okay,
always
now,
been done.
yeah.
Notice, Charlie, when they do this step they've done so far, that I think they see it as a bigger political move than a legal one. And, they're wanting California to up the ante. California's indulging them. Yes, I agree. And
Okay,
the
so
Marines
talk to
are
me a
already
little.
there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mhm. Well, I mean, we're talking about the history and the norms and everything. Well, there's
Yeah.
also the century-old law, more than century-old law, posse comitatus, which at least on the surface bars the use of active duty military for law enforcement purposes. Correct, but the Insurrection Act basically wipes that out, right? I mean, that
Yeah.
just
So almost
basically
what it
means we can
says.
do anything we want.
Yeah. Basically, yeah, that's the very principle I'm talking about. That's the law that actually effectuated it. And of course, it
Mhm.
says, right,
Yeah.
you have to be, what if,
Okay.
I don't know, France invades tomorrow? Of course, it says, except where Congress has authorized exceptions. And, really, if I can be coarse, where the shit is truly hitting the fan,
hmm
that's the only time it should be permissible. But if Trump really takes liberties with what that means, will the courts let him? That's the ultimate legal question I'm nervous about.
Well, what law is he citing to justify deploying the active duty Marines? We have 700 Marines who've been sent to
Ready? Yeah.
Los Angeles. I have not seen that he's invoked the Insurrection Act. We have this memo from Kristi Noem saying that she's been authorized to use the military for law enforcement. So in effect, are they basically saying we're, we're going to do it anyway without
No.
actually ever invoking? What are they doing?
Yeah, right now they're saying, you 700 guys, be ready. There's an argument that even without the Insurrection Act, they can do like certain logistical things to help, but they cannot be law enforcement officers. When the time comes where it says we're sending them in and banging heads, that will be because he's
Okay.
invoked the Insurrection Act. They're there, they're ready to go, but he has to invoke, as they did in 1992 at the governor's
Right.
request, as they've done a handful of times in order for those military guys to be turned into police officers. And by the way, if they do, Charlie, these guys don't know. I mean, that's a real special training, how to handle a riot, etc. Friction
Things
with
can
the
go wrong.
states. They don't know what's going on, danger. There's 100 practical reasons that it's a terrible idea to have them and the country doesn't need them. But legally, you need to do that exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, which is the Insurrection Act.
Okay, so let's talk about the politics, and I'm going to engage in
Yeah.
some low red punditry here. I had the feeling, look, I mean, immigration and cracking down on immigration has been Donald Trump's signature issue from even before he came down the golden escalator, but it has certainly been a core issue. So he's got two big, I mean, he's got a fetish for tariffs, but he's also got a fetish for the military and for using them with immigrants. But how does this politically play out? My sense is that the public was not enthusiastic about some of the tactics that were being used. There was a certain desperation when Stephen Miller says, let's go to Home Depot, let's go to 7-Elevens
Right.
to find this. We're not arresting enough. And people were hearing these stories. They were hearing the story of the mom who was taken away. They heard the story of people who were wrongly deported. I'm hoping that Americans were troubled by the lack of due process. Polls would suggest they were. The masked agents, not a good look. So that was
Yes.
not a big winner. I do think that right now, Trump is looking at what's happening in Los Angeles and says, this is the show I want. They're spoiling for a fight. They feel that they have, this is the Trump show. And the Trump show, what he wants is, strong government against these radical rioters. And I think that right now, it's on the bubble. What do you think? I mean, I You
Yeah.
look at a lot of media, people are seeing burning cars. They're seeing people throwing rocks at police officers. They're seeing masked protesters waving Mexican flags in front of burning cars. Every single time we see one of those images, I have to tell you, it's like giving Donald Trump and MAGA free advertising. But what is your take on this?
I basically totally agree, as I usually do, Charlie, with your political sense. But look, we know it's the fight he wanted because it's the fight he picked.
Yes.
It's malarkey to think that he was forced into it. And I'll just say one more thing about his fetish: not only power, not only immigration, but this is the quintessential blue state and the city within the blue state. So he loves shoving it down their throat. But I think that the battle of anecdotes and images is just exactly what everyone on the political side is watching second by second. The notion of military force coming into the cities, there's some hesitation about, but I was really surprised that when phrased in terms of his overall immigration program, and this is just within the last couple of days, Americans that supported him for president are still basically with him, 54 to 46 on the overall, kind of, is he doing what we want him to be doing? So it could well be that this seems abhorrent, and triple abhorrent if you're a rule of law guy because of the legal steamrolling. But that's the kind of fight that he wants for the base that he has. So I do think, though, what you'll see on the other side, there's a fight. Newsom saying, it's basically peaceful with a few marauders, and the administration is saying, revolution in the streets. And that's the battle for heart and minds. And part of that is anecdotes. And as you say, every time you have a masked marauder throwing a big rock at a federal officer, that plays into Trump's hands.
No, and again, it's hard to know exactly how this is going to play out. There's a lot that is on the bubble here. I mean, things could turn sour very, very quickly if there's shooting on either side. I just think that if there are protests, it is so crucial that they be massive, but they be peaceful, and
Right.
that and people need to understand
And
also.
they be perceived as such.
That's
Yeah.
right. And look, I mean, the reality is that they'll pick any anecdote, as you point out. They'll pick, one Antifa guy with a rock becomes the story on Fox News. And I do understand that. On the other hand, if there is a large turnout of people, then I think that might be more likely to be effective. I got embroiled in an online controversy about my comment that I thought it was just politically unwise for protesters to be waving Mexican flags just for the symbolism and the politics. And people saying, well, this is our heritage. Well, at this particular moment, I'm not sure that is helping your cause. And I'm trying to imagine a mass demonstration against Trump's policy with lots and lots of American flags, because the
Right.
imagery of the National Guard or the police attacking a group of American flag waving Americans is very different than the imagery of rocks going back and forth with mass people carrying the flag of another country.
I gotta say, I agree with you. You're just making a political, pragmatic point. Of course, it shouldn't be the case that people should need to hide their identities and the like. But some of the most effective statements I heard on TV were like from Joe America down the line saying, I don't see an emergency in immigration. I do see all these feds coming in and cracking heads. But it's so hard to think about this, a whole different sort of media issue. But how do you cover this big kind of conflagration? You can go either way. What's the sexy kind of catnip for the cameras? And they have, so in that sense, the media plays an important role. But I do want to say, it looks as if these demonstrations are expanding to other cities, including New York City. So you may have a repeat. Will the bulk of the country think the country is under siege? It certainly wasn't the case, Charlie, 3-4 days ago when they were doing these very aggressive immigration maneuvers that people objected to. But there wasn't blood in the streets. But it really serves Trump's purposes if there are. And I think, again, on the political side, he could have invoked the Insurrection Act already. We could have thought from things that were
Yeah.
said in the campaign or J.D. Vance that, yeah, they're
Mhm.
spoiling to do it. But I think on the contrary, they really want to think that this will be received, not by everyone, of course, but by the, 50, 60% of the country with some approval. Notice they're going back repeatedly to the George Floyd protests and the ones that happened
Okay
after. It's
with
a
that.
similar Rorschach test for Americans. But if a basic critical mass think, poor Donald Trump, he had to do this to protect us and protect the country, he's going to get away with it.
Okay, so I completely agree with you, and I think that they're perhaps holding off for an incident that becomes so dramatic or
Yes,
so graphic that becomes the incident. Let's go back to the George Floyd protests and some of the
sure.
riots back in back in 2000, because I want to engage in a little revisionist history for folks, because I know that there was a lot of talking points, I think, among progressives and Democrats that, well, law and order is not working for Donald Trump the way that he was hoping that he was. And he was playing the 1968 playbook all over again.
Yes, yes.
In retrospect, I do think that that issue, those riots, those images, almost elected Donald Trump. He was defeated, but it was much closer than people thought. In the state of Wisconsin, I think that he would have lost by a much larger margin, except for what happened in Kenosha. And I think that there was a certain amount of denial about that. I mean, we have that famous picture of the CNN reporter standing in front of this massive burning, saying, "Yeah, largely peaceful protest." And people said, are you kidding me?"
Yeah.
So I do think there's a real danger here. Anyone who thinks that the law and order issue is still not incredibly potent is really living in a bubble, because it is. And I do remember the 60s riots. In many ways, that was the end of the liberal era, that for the New Deal, Fair Deal, Great Society era. And I think people need to be
Yeah.
conscious of
And
that.
the beginning of the
Yeah,
Southern strategy, right? The Republicans moving
yeah,
to a sort of law and order. That was maybe what gave Richard Nixon the victory in 1968. Look, if to the extent the country thinks, wow, we are on fire and we need someone to put it out,
they'll go for the
that's
strong
Donald
man.
Trump, right? That's the strong man role that he's nominated himself for since he came down the escalator. That's why these sort of contingencies of what plays on TV and what anecdote
Yeah,
gets elevated and what gets diminished really matters. I don't think people will be looking so
they
much to
do.
what Charles Breyer thinks in the courts, etc. And there will what Trump ultimately needs, what we need to be able to evade the authoritarian prospect he presents, is popular will against it. And this is his really best shot. I think it's always been
Well,
to have the popular will with him. If they really think that somehow the country is on fire, which strikes me as radically counterfactual,
yeah.
but that doesn't matter these days, I think.
Well, you're absolutely right. This is incredibly dangerous, because what would
Yeah,
Donald Trump do with that emergency power? I think that we have, I think, suffered in the past from a lack of imagination about what he is capable of doing. I
yeah,
think that's becoming less and less the case. But Donald Trump wants the emergency. He wants the sense of crisis. He wants the country to turn to him as the strong man. And I think that he's very close to feeling that there are no restraints on him whatsoever. There are no guardrails. There are no legal limits to what he will do. And he is thrilled by the process. I mean, honestly, if you've listened
I
to him
do.
over
I
the
think so.
last few years, he is thrilled by the prospect of violence. And so, he's not necessarily, as you point out, he's not necessarily waiting for the fire. He's going to go set the fire and then declare that only he can put it out. Okay, I want to get your reaction on this, because among the very disturbing things that have happened over the last 72 hours or so, and maybe this is one of those blips, but I thought his performance at Fort Bragg, where he is speaking in front of these soldiers and their families, and he is giving basically a MAGA campaign speech, a campaign rally,
Right.
encouraging the soldiers to boo and hiss at his political enemies, to cheer the MAGA agenda. This was one of those breathtaking moments that he's not only desensitized us to the so many things, but there's a radicalization going on among the military. And this is why I said the wishful thinking, the people thinking that these soldiers are going to are going to disobey the orders. he is using them as a prop, and his willingness to politicize and radicalize the men and women in uniform, given everything that's happened, is deeply alarming. And I was already alarmed before that happened. What was your
And
reaction?
remember, he's now replaced the people in the military who
Oh,
wouldn't
yeah.
have wanted this job. No, it's bad for the country and the military, with hand-picked lackeys. So, out to Mark
Yep.
Milley, to whoever tried. Yeah, what I thought
Yeah.
of, Charlie, when I saw that was the Red Guard, the people whom Putin or others look over so lovingly when they and there. Did you see he issued all these orders about how they have to look at the grand military parade for his birthday, which is just, it doesn't work that way in democracies. Can you imagine George Washington calling for such a parade at the cost of over
No,
$100
literally
million?
no one.
But
No.
yeah, literally
No, no,
no
no,
one.
no one.
Yeah.
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 No, no,
I
no,
agree.
no president, no president
Right.
would have done that.
Yeah.
But I think that what he's doing with the military, I mean, it was so breathtaking that. Also,
Yeah.
I had the same reaction that Tom Nichols had. His great piece yesterday in the
Yeah.
Atlantic, where he said,
In the
the
Atlantic. Yeah.
silence of the generals, because you can certainly imagine in a different time, different timeline, that you would have, people in the chain of command saying, it was inappropriate that the cadets reacted the way they, not the cadets, I mean, that the troops reacted the way that they did, or this was inappropriate for a military base. There are rules and regulations about the politicization of the military. Donald Trump doesn't give a shit about any of those. I mean, let's just remind ourselves that there are consequences to having a convicted felon as president of the United States. But nobody in that chain of command has spoken up or will speak up, because at this point, any dissent from Trump means the end of your career. They are all afraid. So, as you point out, you don't have a Mark Milley in the room with him. You don't have a Mark Esper in the room with him. You don't have anybody in the chain of command that is willing to speak truth to this particular orange power. And so, and that
Yeah.
is really alarming.
Really alarming. And he has done this everywhere. This is one of the first steps of Project 2025. Nichols
Yeah.
nailed it. I mean, he went all the way through. It was pretty riveting to see that kind of implicit fight in the 2020 build up and the insurrection. And you knew that the military would balk. They don't want to be used this way. But just as you said, this is the same thing that's going on with the Marshal Service, the people who execute judicial orders. Trump now has the top dogs in. They are lackeys, and they'll do as he says. So this would be career ending. I think before, there's a certain tradition of professionalism in the military that permits, if you really are prudent and limited, and for that reason, the statements fall with such volume, to say no, this is not a good idea in the United States of America. And he has wired that part already, and you have people kind of throughout. This is also the case in the National Guards, who they know they'll lose their jobs right away. They've laid the table if we're going to get paranoid, and I think now's the time to at least indulge paranoid fantasies. You got to start with the point that they've set the table very well and carefully not to have the kind of pushback on behalf of democracy that Trump got in his first term.
Oh, I think that's true. Okay, let's go back to his first term when he was talking about how to deal forcefully with the protesters. And by the way, if you look at the rhetoric, I mean, they are just itching, I think, to escalate things. But do you remember that incident in the first term where he talked about, well, why can't we just shoot the protesters in the legs or something? And then of course there were people in the room who explained that no, you cannot do that, Mr. President. You had Mark Esper, you had even Attorney General Bill Barr, you had Mark Milley.
That's the baloney, the White House counsel. There are laws, in fact, right?
Right. None of them or anyone like that is there. No one. Somebody in the Oval Office says, yeah, let's start shooting them in the legs, see how they feel about that. Is there a single person who's going to push back and say, Mr. President, you cannot do that? That would be wrong. I mean, and
they haven't shown up yet, right? I mean, that is the number one difference. And I really want to say this, I can speak with some authority as a lawyer, whom they've curated and called out. We're talking about that thin a group of people from not even the far, it's not even a right wing, left wing, it's a total authoritarian,
Yeah.
constitutionalist kind of dimension. Almost every Republican wouldn't assert this kind of power, but he's very carefully put in. It's not even the smartest types, it's just the yes people. That's who is
Right.
now there. So no one, they would lose their job. But anyway, what they're there to do, you saw this with Bondi, every time it comes up, is to extol him and make him look like the great strong man he wants to be. So the short answer is, I think that's right. There is nobody in the room. That's why so much falls to the courts. Now, I do want to say his MO for taking over the country will, I think, if he tries to do it, will be more legal. He won't have the military, seize control of
No.
Springfield, Illinois. What he'll do is try to expand these emergency powers, apply them to elections. Say we have
You
an
think so?
emergency here, and said that's the thing I most fear. But at that point, we had very strong reason to think that the military, among others, would not go along with it. They would know what it was. And
Yeah.
I do think he has wired it here. And those are the sorts of interactions that the people, by and large, don't really have a sense of. It happens or it doesn't happen. It's not
So
a matter of national protest. Sorry, go ahead.
I don't usually think of myself as naive, but I've always thought
Yeah,
that the predictions that he would use his power to interfere with
yeah.
the midterm elections was perhaps a little far fetched. But now I'm starting to think. So, do you think that he wouldn't? And how would that look? I mean, he would declare an emergency in certain areas, and then what would happen with the election?
Yeah, something like this. He would say there's an emergency. Why is there an
Yeah,
emergency? We have an emergency here because immigrants are over turning our
yeah,
country, and there's all these
yeah.
marauders. Why is there an
He
emergency
just
there?
make shit up.
Because
Yeah.
there's terrible fraud in the land. We've got to come
Mm.
in and make sure everyone's civil right to vote is protected, and you can see then how it plays out. Now, Charlie, we saw him try to do this with the Alien Enemies Act, and we saw the courts push back. I'm quite concerned that when it comes to this sort of thing, emergency powers for conflict riots on the ground, they'll let him. I think elections is, a middle ground. He'll say there's emergencies, and courts, at least lower courts, will first say, what emergencies? These elections ran smooth as could be. There's no emergencies. This is you're trying to do a power grab. You just gotta hope that the courts perceive the stakes here. I mean,
Yeah, boy.
we go back and forth on the Supreme Court justices and in the run of cases, but my God, they are each sophisticated enough, down to Alito and Thomas, who, by the way, may be retiring in the next few weeks. But just to know this democracy is on the line here. And would they really be so lockstep with Trump as to countenance the end of the American experiment? Man, oh man, oh man. That's, I think, that'll be the writing on the wall if we go to the elections piece of this.
Okay, so this raises the question. I know you've written about
Yeah.
this. One of the most interesting breaks in Trump world, besides the Elon Musk thing, which continues to be fascinating. And by the way,
Yeah.
that Elon Musk is groveling his way back. Oh, I'm really sorry I didn't do this.
So
So
soon? Yeah, geez. I thought
no,
he's got
no
some
one.
cash too. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. He's the world's richest man, and he is
Yeah.
on
What's he
his
needed? Yeah.
knees saying, "Oh, please take me back." And you know what? Trump will. I don't know that it'll take him back, but he will exact, the maximum amount of humiliation, because the way to
Yeah.
win your way back
And
is
then do it
to
again. Yeah.
self-gelding, humiliate yourself, and then do it again and again and again. But also, it shows this climate we're in right now, where
Yeah.
if you have the sort of you have the world's richest man and the world's most powerful man, who wins was not even a close contest. Trump can make Elon Musk substantially less rich. Elon Musk has no power to make Trump less powerful. But I want to talk
Right.
about the Federalist Society, because this goes to the question of the courts. I mean, the Federalist Society is the beating heart of conservative legal movement, which arguably has been fantastically successful in remaking the courts. Donald Trump basically outsourced all of his judicial appointments to the Federalist Society. Leonard Leo, has reshaped the federal judiciary along with, say, Mitch McConnell. But now there is a break. So
Yeah.
give me your sense of what's happening, because on one level, all of these judges know the Federalist Society. They come from the Federalist Society. And I'm just getting the sense that there's more and more skepticism among conservative judges about what Trump is doing, including Trump appointees. So what is the downstream effect of this in terms of the courts, Harry?
I actually have a sense of this. I have some good
Mm,
friends. I clerked with them who are in the Federal
mm,
Society, and I always want to hear from them. How can you
mm,
possibly support this guy? And there are different versions they try to give. But I think
mm,
the Federal Society is internally roiled. I think a lot of people in the Federalist Society, including Peter Keisler co-founded the Federal Society.
mm-hmm,
He's
mm-hmm.
now left over just this issue because obviously they've abandoned their conservative principles. And I think the critics, including the critics from within, say, you guys have just had your head turned by power. You know that if you shut up, you have the power that you have, not simply to choose judges, but to raise money. And I think it started out first, it's been phenomenally successful, as you say, and it had a certain kind of idealism. And I think there's now a deep schism in the Federalist Society over exactly this. People are smart enough to understand this is really anti-democratic. They maybe disagree on how dangerous it
I
is,
think
but
I think
the
that's been
society right now, it has a deep I've spoken there. I have a fair number of
yeah.
friends that I know there, and there's j'accuse going on within the ranks. But if it weren't them, one way they think about it is, if it weren't them, it'd be somebody else. Like now, for instance, it looks like it may not be them. And Mike Davis, that's a name we may hear more and
Oh
more, a
shit.
former Gorsuch
Oh
clerk.
really?
It will
Oh
be. So that's sort of what they're thinking.
yeah.
I
You think it
actually
can't
have a
get worse?
reunion this weekend for Justice Kennedy, whom I clerked for, and so did Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh, whom I numbered among my friends. But it's been a few years. Anyway, I do think that
That should be
yes,
fun.
people understand not just as a personal matter, what a disgusting person he is, but as a constitutional matter. And some of them have nevertheless said, we're gonna that they see instrumental value in going along. It's not, but others have not. So it's a funky time for the
Uh,
Federalist
it's
Society. But as I
funky time.
say, I don't think their bottom line is if they go away, someone else will replace them. So.
Yeah, somebody worse. Okay, so let's talk about Pam Bondi. You wrote about her. I mean, in many ways, yeah, exactly. The Matt Gaetz was horrible, and people thought, well, Pam Bondi can't be as bad. And Washington Post actually endorsed her confirmation. But let's just focus on the Abrego Garcia case. Just a quick update on that. It turns out the administration blinked sort of. They brought him back from El Salvador, but they immediately indicted him. And then Pam Bondi comes out and gives this press conference, which you wrote about. Give me the short version of that, because that was a shit
Yeah.
show, horror show, all wrapped in one.
Shit show, wrapped. Yeah, I mean, you always say it better, but I was a U.S. attorney. It is so elementary and second nature. You don't go like trashing a defendant and saying things that aren't in the indictment. And she did it again and again
Okay.
and again and again, as well as political points to what's the difference here. Donald Trump is now president, so our borders are safe. A total non sequitur. But this is where my fuddy-duddy side comes out, but it's not fuddy-duddy when you're talking about the presumption of innocence. It was just foul. And I'm here to tell you, Charlie, I think she's been terrible, even watching from the outside, but people inside the department are just horror-struck, just passing her in the hall. She has been an absolute, derelict rogue of an attorney general, including expressly converting their jobs into being there for Donald Trump. She fired someone who had the nerve to say, well, yeah, we made a mistake with Abrego Garcia. That got him fired. It's really so woeful there. And it raises the question, what's going to happen if she left tomorrow? But there's never been an attorney general like this. She totally flouts the rules in a way that deeply matters. I'll tell you, as I finish that piece, my worry, they've done so much wrong here, starting from sending him down by mistake, and the things she did. But it seems to me that they may well have him on this one small part of the indictment, and they might really put pressure on them to plead, in which case the whole thing sort of goes away and we don't learn about what, the bigger sort of democratic
Right.
issues of what they did and did wrong. But yeah, I'm just talking chapter and verse. Office of Professional Responsibility, if it were functioning, it always has been, would just totally take it. It's not a close call. You can't get up there and say, oh, it was his full-time job and $100,000 a year, and here's what the grand jury found. No, they didn't. It's not in the indictment. Grand juries don't make stray findings. It's all about the children. It was really inflammatory, inaccurate, outside the four corners, politicized. I like just stomach turning for any DOJ veteran, Republican or Democrat.
It is
Really
breathtaking
bad.
watching them
Yeah.
marching through the institutions and
Sure.
destroying the traditions and the norms without blinking, and the damage that they've done. I mean, the years and
So
years,
true.
decades, if not centuries of experience that they are losing. They're being replaced by the loyalists. You mentioned the U.S. Marshal Service just before you and I
Yeah.
began this conversation. We got the story that the FBI wants to move from Quantico to Huntsville, Alabama. So it's one law enforcement, one legal agency, one military after another.
Got a big
Where,
one. Yeah.
but this is a big one. So your take on what they're doing with the FBI, because the damage, I think, is going to be very difficult to repair. They're very clearly determined to destroy the FBI. Do
Yeah,
you agree,
notice who
or
are
is that
the
overstating it?
number one and two people. You have FBI antagonists. They promised after putting Cash Patel in, you'd put someone who you've always had in one of the two positions, really in both. Someone experienced, knows the FBI. They did not do it. It's been the poster child for Trump's antipathy toward the federal government. For it's such a bizarre turn of events that Republicans are so anti-law enforcement. But this is a way, absolutely, just like you storm into California, you show your domination. You put them to Huntsville, Alabama, meaning they're in the field office now. By the way, another thing in the last 24 hours, it looks like they want to revive Guantanamo
Oh
and
yes, right.
send
Hmm.
all illegal people whose papers aren't in order down there. What they've used before for 9/11. But yes, they are just absolutely in public, this kind of Trump from March 15th, 2017, taking the stripes in public off Jim Comey. The FBI, I'm here to tell you, does so much. I understand they're a little starchy. It's tough to be up against them, but man, oh man, what they do to protect the country, to enforce laws, how much you need them when things go awry. And yeah, he's looking to basically completely disempower them down in Huntsville, Alabama, with no even leaders to raise a stink about it, because the leaders have been picked in advance not to raise a stink. And yeah, and they are also deep. And I just want to go back to the point you made in passing, Charlie. The DOJ, the FBI, so many of them work based on the received guidance and wisdom of like 10%, 5% of the people who stayed there forever know how it's done, how it should be done. Keep them on the straight and
Yeah.
narrow, because it's not clear what that should be. And those are the very people who are now being, shown the door or given jobs in North Dakota. But yes, Huntsville, Alabama. I don't know what Tuberville, what Alabama senator profits from that, but I know who loses, and that's the American people. You do not want, if the FBI screws up, there are plenty of legal means to go after them. You do not want them weaker. They're really have big battles against some very bad guys out there that would do harm to the U.S., especially internationally. And for weird, like, imagistic reasons, it seems to me, Charlie, just he likes the sense of it, that he's the guy who harmed the FBI, and with zero, I mean zero, I mean less than zero sense of the actual impact on the ground to Americans' lives. This also comes up in colleges and the like. Sorry, I got on my high
No,
horse
no,
for a
no.
second.
I mean, these are all really important points.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm probably going to regret even bringing up this question, because it seems like
Go for it.
a digression. But because, for 10 years we've been asking, well, what is the breaking point for Republicans in
Right.
Congress? And the answer is, like, trick question, spoiler alert, there is no red line.
Yeah.
They will never break with him. On the other hand, there are these specifics, and I was thinking about the the whole RFK Jr. Senator Cassidy story, where
Yeah.
why would you confirm RFK Jr. to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services? Well,
Yeah.
Senator Cassidy, who's a doctor, exacted this very explicit promise that you will not mess with this particular agency dealing with vaccine approval. I mean, black letter promise, accepted, believed. And Kennedy just obviously lied to him about all of that.
Right.
And you just kind of
Right.
wonder whether,
Yeah.
that at some point you go, okay, look, we're Republicans, but we don't want, planes falling out of the sky. We don't want measles epidemics. We don't want these chodes doing all of this, but we're not there yet. And I will be interested to see what Cassidy does, because at some point you would hope that a member of the U.S. Senate would reclaim their manhood on when they've been lied to so egregiously, but not so
And let me
far.
just add a little bit to it. Again, politics being more your
Yeah.
bailiwick, but at the time, with him, with no Ernst, there was the tangible prospect that Musk would come in, drop $500 million or whatever to try to
Yes.
defeat them.
Yes.
That's gone, and also the big beautiful bill is looking like, you would know better, like a total stinker. And any vulnerable, there seem already to be two senators, Soto Voce, who are against it. And if that goes down, I think that's a mini breaking point for some. He's governing on a razor's edge margin, and as you say, in a sort of terroristic way. So it wouldn't take much. But man, this is historians will figure this out, but again and again and again, by the narrowest of margins, he brings them back. And what the courts can do, what the people can do, what the state power, people in power can do when your old party, the Republicans in both the Senate and House are in lockstep and permit themselves to be. I mean, the real theme he's doing is completely usurping congressional power, and they're just letting him. Something
It's
the
amazing.
framers thought would never happen. And man, it so narrows the cards for democracy to play when that's the situation. We keep waiting for a clean break. It does occur to me that maybe we'll get like mini breaks. But, if this bill goes down,
Yeah, I
for
don't know.
example, and it's just a continuing resolution, would that mean that Trump has been, I think we're still in the same dynamic.
Yeah, no, I don't think he cares that much about it. He wants
Yeah.
a win, and so the thing about Donald Trump is it doesn't matter what the content is, as long as he can claim there's a win, and so he'll get
Right.
something that he can call the big beautiful bill. Okay, so now
And
I
he
have the
always does
ultimate.
claim a win, even when he loses, right? Yeah.
Well, exactly. Okay, so
Yeah.
here's my ultimate digression. This is my ultimate
Okay.
contrarian take. Do you know? We were discussing, the militarization of, the jackbooted, troops moving into the cities and everything.
Right.
All of the questions about authoritarianism and tyranny and everything. You know who we're not hearing from at all these days? At all? The
Barack
Second
Obama?
Amendment.
No.
The Second
Oh,
Amendment,
yes.
folks,
Very good point,
who were
right?
constantly for years and years and years when I was on the radio, and it was like, why do you need to have assault
Yeah.
weapons? Why do you need it? Well, we need to have these weapons in order to fight off a tyrannical government. And I always ask the question, who would you shoot? I wanted to hear how this works out. Are you saying that your guns will be used? You'll shoot cops, you'll shoot agents, you'll shoot members of the active military? I mean, is that the whole point of it? I literally have not heard any of the Second Amendment people or anybody bringing up the fact, thank God we have the Second Amendment because we can turn our guns on the government. I'm sorry, I just have to throw that out because I had that conversation.
No, it makes sense.
I
And
called
you really
this my
lived it.
who would
You know how-
you shoot topic. Who really?
Right.
Let's walk.
And
let's
I mean,
walk
you
through
fielded
this.
all these calls, and it is really important because it's kind of like we have met the enemy and they are us. All of a sudden they're embracing the people who would do what they've always been complaining about. I think, Charlie, and I would defer to you, but this gets to really the heart of the matter that historians will be figuring out. Is it that, is it the Second Amendment? Is it taxes? Is it immigrants, et cetera? Or is it somehow more like emotional and psychological and a desire to really impose pain on these liberal elites, et cetera? I don't want, I'm not an expert here, but you can't help but notice that, again and again, there doesn't seem to be consistency with the positions, and there doesn't seem to be relatedly an inroad based on argument. It's just it feels more visceral than that. And in a similar way, in Los Angeles, it's we got the troops in there and doing it. Similar way, we're getting rid of the immigrants. I just think that's a big part of it. But I understand I'm treading on thin ice, and
No,
I'm
you're
no
not. No. This is
yeah,
important to understand. Otherwise, you can't
yeah,
explain the policy shifts
yeah,
of Republicans that were,
and
on
know
one
what'll
side
work
now
and
flips.
what won't work going forward.
Yeah.
Right.
No, it's a lot of it is attitude. It is identity, and it is some strange lust for power that Donald Trump obviously has, but also that he's tapped into. Harry Littman, it is always great to talk with you. I want to hear about your reunion afterwards. I want to hear what goes on.
Okay. Yeah.
Sounds like it's going to be fun.
That might be a little confidential, but yeah, it's great, Charlie. And next time, if you will, I'll invite you over to my house and we'll do a different Talking Feds. We'll do a Substack together. Your take on what's happening on the ground, as I more and more look to as things get more and more
thank you.
funky.
Well, we are, and things are going to get more and more funky, which is why we continue to do this podcast as a reminder to all of you that we are not the crazy ones. But you knew I was going to say that, right? Thanks.
Yeah.